If I had to give you one take-home message when you're thinking of housing cattle this winter to try and maximise health, minimise cost incurred through ill health, is to think about stress and minimising stress. What does stress mean to cattle? When we think of our calves, or we think about, thanks very much, Francis. We think about calves, stores, cows, everything. It could be nutritional stress. It could be coming off poor autumn forage into the house onto poor quality silage. It could be, as Kieran was talking about, feed space, something simple like that, putting animals into different groups. They're social, cattle are social animals, used to being in groups. Keeping mixing in different animals is extremely stressful to calves and weanlings when you're going to think about stocking if you're buying in stores this winter. There's disease stress, there's housing stress through climate change, putting them in on a wet, windy day. All of those things are things to think about in advance. Is today the best day to put the cattle in? Kind of hold off till a better day in the weather. As well as thinking about parasites, worms, and pneumonia. We'll come on to all of that now. So an overall theme of this is the same as yourself in a busy calving period, and if you have lamb and ewes in the spring, if you're flat out and you're not taking time to look after yourself, you get sick. So trying to minimise those things will hopefully help your animals support their immune system to fight disease. Thinking about how we might stress animals or to avoid stress animals at housing, thinking about our suckler cow and calf. If you can and it's appropriate for a spring-born calf, try and get them weaned and settled at grass. Do it gradually, supplement the calf, be that with creep grazing forward in front of the cows, taking cows away from the group rather than calves in small numbers to try and keep them very settled, rather than a big stressful thing on one day. Take them away from mummy, put them in a house, squeeze them, dehorn them, dose them and do everything else. There's just no place for that now. We need to be better organised to try and manage the young calves so that housing isn't a stressful instance for them. Quick comment, it'll come up again, but I'll not labour the point. BVD, we're a lot further on than we were. I would wish we were further on again, but if you had BVD positive calves identified in your herd this spring and you took the chance and kept them through this breeding season, you've taken a big risk. The risk is you could end up with more PI calves born next year. Putting that PI calf into the house alongside other healthy calves, those healthy calves are up to 50% more likely to take disease. So there is simply, in my opinion, there is no place for retaining that calf. That calf's going to cost you money. They're talking about £12 a head as a margin. Keeping that calf is going to cost you money. It's going to cost your other animals' health. Make the decision and get rid. You may have got away with it during grazing because they're further away, they're not as closely stocked. When they go into the house, you're highly likely to have problems. From my time in practice, I would say 95% of the times we were called out to investigate vaccine failures where people had vaccinated against pneumonia and felt it hadn't worked. There was a BVD PI in the house. It was before the eradication programme. People weren't testing, they didn't know, they were caught unawares, be it was a store that was bought or a calf of their own. They hadn't realised at that point. But without question, keeping a BVD PI is going to cost you money in the long term. Nope. It's not working. Oh, hold on. So weanlings with something to think about, and people talk about women in shopping, but men in shopping are farmers, men and female, male and female, shopping for weanlings in the back end. I think our buying habits, we need to think about those, especially if you're buying a lot of weanlings. The habit of going a couple of nights a week and buying 2 and 3 and mixing them together is adding to stress. If you can, without question, think about biosecurity, buying a single group from a single source. Unfortunately, I know the way that our industry is here, it's simply not possible for people who want to buy big numbers, but buying in dribs and drabs and constantly mixing is are stressing those animals and are leaving them more likely to disease. When you come to the market at a night and animals maybe have been weaned that day, they've been mixed in a pen, they've stood for a couple of hours, they've been mixed on a lorry, stood for a couple of hours, travelled around the countryside and then dropped off a few, you leave them off, put them in a pen together and throw a bit of rough silage up in front of them. They're stressed to the max, their immune system's on the floor. Some people would think they're doing a good thing and right, let's get the vaccine in them now, we're protecting them. I would argue their immune system's already on the floor, and we need an immune system that's able to respond to vaccines in order to get the value for money in buying the vaccination. Without question, if you can, big bedded pen, leave them to settle for a couple of days, monitor them for signs of sickness, give them high quality feed, plenty of space, and letting them settle for those couple of days will just let them find their feet, and they're in a much better place to respond to a vaccine and to administer routine treatments. Doing it all at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night when they've been standing in the mart since 5 o'clock in the morning, it's too much. And if you're going to spend that money on vaccination, which I would urge you to consider, you need to know that you're spending the money well to get value out of it. So have a think about that. Without question, across the world, the biggest cause of morbidity and mortality in cattle of all ages is bovine respiratory disease, so pneumonia. It's really complex. There's not one single cause. There are bacterial causes, parasitic causes, viral causes, things that lead cattle more prone to it, like other immunosuppressants, your BVD, your concurrent lungworm infection, housing, humid housing, poor ventilation. Oh, it's a lovely big melting pot of disease. There isn't a single bottle I can give you that'll make it go away. If there was, I'd be very rich. It's the biggest reason for use of antibiotics in the cattle industry, which, as we're talking about marketing our product, without doubt the consumers' massive issue which is coming for human health, it's here, human health, and for the veterinary industry as well, is the use of antibiotics. And without question, a lot of the antibiotics currently used against bovine respiratory disease are classed as critically important antibiotics, and it's simply becoming not acceptable to the consumer that so much antibiotics has been used and is being used in, for example, the fight against bovine respiratory disease. Without question, prevention is better than cure. When you're born, same as with cattle, you're born with a set of lungs. When they get damaged, they don't have the ability to regenerate. So your liver, to a point, will have an ability to get over infection and inflammation, and will be able to a point, heal itself. When your lungs are damaged, they're damaged, and you're compromised. Anyone who's had a really bad cough or cold and struggled, you'll know it means that that animal will always be compromised because of that. You'll have all seen the signs: high temperature, not eating, breathing very fast, possibly discharge from the eyes and nose. This limousine here, this wasn't too far away from here. A gentleman bought it a couple of years ago before the BVD eradication program, bought it in the mart as a weanling, along with others. The batch hadn't done well, but it was the poorest one. He called in, I got some injections, and then he got the vet out, and then I went out to see it, and covered in ulcers, everything else. It was a BVD PI. So he wanted me to give it more expensive antibiotics. He'd spent over £200 on it already in treatment. He wanted me to give it more, and I said, well, we'll take a blood test and we'll see, but I think this is throwing good money after bad, and it was PI. But just at that time, we had no eradication program. I'm not saying it was sold intentionally. It was sold and it was bought. Put it down, went back to him, and he called in, and he said, his comment was, when we'd removed it, he couldn't believe how well the rest of the batch turned out to be. So it was the only one that was a PI, but it was dragging the rest of them down, costing him money. So again, think about concurrent disease. That PI needs to go. Think about worming, think about fluke treatments as well. In AFBI, 25% of the postmortems we did last year in cattle, the cause of death was bovine respiratory disease. So how does it cost you? Now, thinking of a suckler calf, so I'm only talking about a small suck calf, a simple case that needs one treatment is likely to cost you about £82. So scale that up for your forward stores, your bigger animals. It's costing you a lot of money. I know vets get a bad rep, and we'll get told it's us that's charging all the money. Biggest problem is in your growth rate. And I don't know anyone who's had experience of a respiratory disease outbreak in very heavy finishing cattle. They melt in front of you and cost a fortune in antibiotics, and they really feel badly. So prevention is much, much better than cure. They've shown as well in a group where 30% of cattle showed clinical signs of BV or BRD, up to 70% actually had lesions at slaughter. So even though you see the one bad one, it may be affecting others in the group. So we really need to think about stock and density, ventilation, housing, humidity, all of those things we were talking about earlier, to try and reduce the incidence of the respiratory disease. Common causes, like I said, can be bacterial, parasitic, and some viruses. Just a note on this graph, Mycoplasma bovis, which is a particular type of antibiotic, looks like it's shooting out in front as a cause. Mycoplasma bovis can be completely normal to be found in healthy airways. So the way that we would determine if this is likely to be a significant cause in death is isolating the bacteria alongside looking at the lung under the microscope. So if you're having complicated cases with BRD and you feel you're getting nowhere, it's worth submitting samples, fresh animals that are dead, lungs, speak to your vet, get them out to think about swabs, things like that. But involve your vet as early as you can, try and save yourself some money. Another comment over on the right-hand side about lungworm this year. This year, our first case of lungworm was diagnosed on the 2nd of June, and we've continued to see a higher incidence of lungworm this year. It's been a great year for it. They're thriving. Today, I had a guy who had wormed 4 weeks ago when he'd given the first pneumonia vaccine to a batch of young calves. Knew he was bringing them in this weekend to give them the second injection, and the calves were really coughing, and he thought it was a reaction to the pneumonia vaccine, so he got his vet out. Yeah, they were dosed with an ivermectin 4 weeks ago, and they've got clinical signs of severe lungworm already. All 5 of them are positive on their feces. So again, think about handling, think about testing, think about your climate conditions. AFBI we put out like a parasite forecast, and start of the grazing scene probably for lungworm and for fluke in the back end. So watch out for that. So vaccination, what's to think about? Vaccination is a really useful tool. Oh, my screen's gone off. Oh, it's back. It's a really useful tool, but as I said, there isn't one bottle that I can sell you that's going to make it be fixed and go away with regard to a vaccine or an antibiotic. It's not as simple as that. So prevention is better than cure. But if you're thinking about vaccination, a couple of really important things to think about is what vaccine to use. So there are a huge collection of vaccines that you can use that cover against different things. So there can be kind of multivalent vaccines, so they cover against more than one virus. There can be ones against bacteria, and it's important to know that you're using one that's appropriate to the class of cattle that you have. So BRD in young calves is very, very different than BRD that you might find in much older, heavier cattle. I would urge you to speak to your vet. If your vet knows your buying patterns, knows the stock you have at home, knows your housing, knows your situation, they should be able to guide you best. If you have any post-mortem information, they can look at that and they can give you advice on what's the best vaccine for you to consider using. I would say I've had people using multiple vets, getting advice from a couple of different people, and they've been vaccinating against the same virus in 2 different vaccines and didn't know it. Other people will say when you have a conversation with them, well, which one's cheapest? And it might be a single IBR vaccine, but that might not be the most appropriate thing for you to use in your young calf. So try and use your head and pick the right one with the guidance of your vet. Other thing about vaccines is how to make them up and how to use them. They're all different. So some vaccines you don't need to reconstitute. If you get 2 bottles in the box and one looks to be empty, with a wee bit at the bottom, it's not empty, that's the vaccine. So I had a man with 300 dairy cows who every 6 months give them sterile water and threw the vaccine away. So if it stops one person doing it, I'll say it. I'm not trying to patronize you. So if it looks empty and there's 2 bottles, you put the water in the other one, mix it up. Vaccines are really, really fragile, so they need to be stored properly. They need to be kept in the fridge. They need to be used within the day they're open. There's no preservative. And this is the problem with the buying patterns of buying 3 this week, 6 next week. You can't keep the vaccine to use next week. It's not going to work. It's a waste of time. So vaccinating in a batch and using up the bottle, that's what you need to do. People as well, 10-dose bottle and they've got 15, so I'll give them a wee bit less. No, it doesn't work like that. If it's a 2 ml dose, it's a 2 ml dose. If it's a 5 ml dose, it's a 5 ml dose. Some vaccines you can give up the nose or into the muscle, speak to your vet. What's the best way to give it? Because the onset of immunity, so when that vaccine has actually worked in the immune system, will be different given by different routes. So you need to understand, if you're going to pay the money for it, it's like you'd go out and buy a new machine and ask all the questions. People will buy vaccine or drugs and not ask. Ask and understand, and they should tell you how it needs to be stored and how it needs to be used. You need to know you're using it properly according to the license to know that it's going to work. If it says they need 2 injections, they need 2 injections. If it says they need 2 injections 4 weeks apart and the onset of immunity is 2 weeks after the second injection, you should be starting your vaccination course 6 weeks before housing. So knowing all of those things, you need to know. Some people will take the chance and they'll give the second injection possibly at the point of housing. It depends on each vaccine, but the onset of immunity may not be for another 2 weeks. So understand what you're doing, what you're buying, so that you're using it as well as you possibly can. Where do you buy your vaccine? You need to buy your vaccine from a reputable source. It needs to be in date, it needs to be stored appropriately. If there was an issue, you need to have come back from that. Not that it should happen, but posting vaccines, buying vaccines that haven't been kept in fridges out of the backs of vans simply shouldn't happen from a veterinary medicine point of view. And if you're going to spend that money, spend it once and spend it well. There's no point in thinking you're getting a good deal. You might as well give me the money as buy rubbish off someone else. Thinking about gutworms. So gutworms, mostly a problem in younger calves in their first grazing season because they've no acquired immunity to the worms. A serious case of gutworms could cost you 100 kilos in growth rate in a first season calf. So it's a big issue. Things to think about at the point of housing are that some gutworms can actually go into a dormant state in the gut, which if we don't choose the right wormer at the point of housing, they'll lie there dormant during housing, and then maybe in the spring come out, get active again, and could cause a fatal enteritis. So choice of wormers at housing time, the white drenches, the benzimidaazoles, only some of them are effective against these encysted types of worms. The yellow drenches, so like your levamisole, Levicide, Levofastimid, they're not effective at all. So your microcyclic lactones, so your Ivermec, Doramectin, Moxidectin, they are effective. So make sure when you're going to buy wormers, you're getting the right advice about what's appropriate to use at that point of housing. Lungworm, again, knowing that you're using something that's effective, and again, consider the route of administration. Do you want to dose them? Do you want to pour it on? If it's a wet day, can you use the product on damp coats? Are you wise to? Do you need to clip them? All of those considerations, you should get advice from your vet or your SQP in your farm shop. Liver fluke is a really big issue in Northern Ireland that I don't think we are dealing with as well as we probably could. Costs a huge amount of money, a lot of it through ill thrift and poor performance. Sheep, you might have acute fluke and sheep dropping dead. Cattle, you can get away with it a bit more, but it's definitely costing you money if you're not considering it and tackling it well. It can take cattle up to 80 days extra to reach market if they're carrying a fluke burden. This is some work from our colleagues, Stephen, at Hillsborough, have been doing with regard to bovis and looking at ante-mortem, post-mortem information. And basically, there's fluke. Cattle coming from all over Northern Ireland have fluke, but certainly the cattle in God's own country in Fermanagh appear to have more fluke than in the east of the province. But if fluke, if your farm is at risk of fluke, you definitely need to be considering fluking any cattle that have grazed in the grazing season at the point of housing, and considering any product you use, how effective it is at that time. The problem is, again, we don't have a perfect product. There isn't a perfect product that doesn't have resistance that will kill all of the early immature fluke. The fluke life cycle lasts for 12 weeks in the animal and about 8 weeks on pasture. So the problem is a lot of our drugs that are commonly used only kill the adults. So you could end up leaving immature fluke in the livers, which is why some people traditionally might give in more seriously affected areas, they may give a fluticide at the point of housing and another one possibly 8 weeks later, coming up to Christmas or whatever. So think about all of that. I would say from an AFBI point of view, we now diagnose fluke 12 months of the year. Other parasites to consider, I find rumen fluke, people have become, in my opinion, a little bit blinded by rumen fluke, and people are more concerned about rumen fluke than they are for liver fluke. From a scientific point of view, I know AgResearch are doing some research into this. The veterinary world would consider that, yes, they've seen deaths in young animals related to rumen fluke, but how significant it is in adult animals, it's a bit more debatable. My advice to you is don't become preoccupied with your rumen fluke and think, because the only drug that is effective against it is called oxyclosinide, which is in your Levofast and things like that, and it's a really bad wormer. So if you're concentrating on this with your young stock, it's likely to be costing you the 100 kilos in the growth rate. You want to be picking a good wormer and think about liver fluke before you think about rumen fluke, in my opinion. Lice and mites tend to become more of a problem during the housing season. Again, think about the products you're using. Don't rely on a wormer that you give at the point of housing to control it. You may have to go with the treatment during housing to combat mites and lice. So when you're thinking about parasites, golden rule, same with antibiotics, as little as possible, but as much as necessary. Underdosing, again, is a waste of money. You want to know that you're dosing effectively. If you're underdosing for antibiotics or anthelmintics, you are selecting for resistance. So you want to use a product and use it well. The reason I've included a County Armagh diet feeder in the picture is it is simply not appropriate to fluke or worm your cattle through a diet feeder. Again, if you want to spend that money, give it to me, because it's a waste of time. And if you don't want to dose cattle orally, think about pour-ons, think about injections, but doing that, you're selecting for resistance, and you're creating a problem. In sheep, they've found resistance across all three widely used groups of wormers. In cattle, they've found it in one, the ivermectin group. It's recorded, but if people continue to use them inefficiently, they will select for resistance, and then their farm will never be profitable if we can't get on top of the parasite issue. So be responsible and use them well. Again, give them the way that it says in the label, read the label, check the dose, check your meat withdrawal, especially forward stores. I should have said with the fluke slide back there, there's also been a strong association with cattle that have more than 4 residencies, more likely to have liver fluke. I would caution you, those are probably the bought-in cattle that people are keeping for 90 days. They're worried about the withdrawal. You're feeding those fluke, they're affecting your feed conversion and your efficiency. So just speak to your vet, have a look at products, look at risk, and think about having a protocol for those bought-in added animals at quarantine. So very quick, a couple of take-home messages. Think about stress, try and minimize it. Hopefully it'll minimize your stress as well. Talk to your vet in advance, get advice. You're much better going and sitting down, thinking about making up protocols when you're going to think about going to buy these cattle, or when you're thinking about before you house these cattle, rather than having a real issue with cows or cattle in the house with pneumonia. Because when they're not converting food efficiently into muscle, they're costing you money, and at £12 a margin, you have to do this way. You have to do your job as well as you possibly can, and take the best advice you can. Be mindful of the increasing awareness and resistance to parasite treatments and antibiotics. The consumer simply won't stand for the use of antibiotics in meat-producing animals that there has been, and we all have to work together to try and reduce this. Ultimately, it's costing you money. Thank you very much to everyone, and I'll leave you a picture of Points Pass.
Thank you, Lindsey. Thank you very much. Thank you.